I'm Margaret Brennan in Washington, and this week on Face the Nation, with former President Trump now officially a convicted felon, how will that impact campaign 2024? Donald Trump was among the faithful when he dropped in on the Saturday Night Ultimate Fighting Championship in New Jersey last night. But what do voters think of the Trump conviction outside the UFC? We've got early reaction from across America, and we'll tell you what's ahead on the legal front.
So we're going to be appealing this scam.
Plus, how's the outcome of the case playing with the parties? For Democrats, it's a defense of the judicial system.
And it's reckless, it's dangerous, it's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict.
And the Republican refrain? Attack it.
The Republican Party is really, they stick together in this. They see it's weaponization of the Justice Department, of the FBI, and you know, that's all coming out of Washington.
North Dakota Governor and Trump running mate contender Doug Burgum will be here, and we'll talk with former U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara. Finally, the U.S. makes a major announcement in hopes of pushing Israel to end the war with Hamas, as the Gaza humanitarian crisis continues to grow. It's all just ahead on Face the Nation. Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. The 7-week New York criminal trial is over. Former President Donald Trump has been found guilty on all 34 charges against him, and he is now able to campaign freely until July 11th, when he will be sentenced. That's exactly 4 days before he is officially nominated at the party's convention in Milwaukee. As a felon, Trump cannot own a firearm or serve in a jury, but he can vote for himself, as he can run and be elected president. But we are clearly in uncharted territory, and it will be some time before we can fully see the impact of the conviction. Our new CBS News poll finds that 57% of Americans think the jury reached the right verdict, with virtually the same share, 56%, saying he received a fair trial. As more evidence of the partisan split in America, 96% of Democrats said the guilty verdict was the right one. So did 56% of independents. But 8 in 10 Republicans say the verdict was the wrong one and that the trial was not fair. Finally, half think that Trump is not fit to be president now that he's convicted, with 40% saying he is and 8% unsure. What you just heard Trump say about the case coming from Washington is not true. Charges in this case were brought by the Manhattan District Attorney. It is a state case, which means an appeal would not automatically go to the Supreme Court. For analysis and context, we want to bring in our chief campaign and elections correspondent, Robert Costa, who covers Trump and the entire trial for us in New York, and our chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford, who has been covering the Supreme Court for decades. But Jan, nothing like this ever before. Jan, can you help us to understand? Trump said he will try to appeal this conviction. What is the next step?
Well, I mean, as he said, this is a long way from over, but there is, I think, zero chance this is going to be overturned before November. And the road ahead for Trump on appeal doesn't look too good either. As for timing, he's got 30 days to file what's called a notice of appeal. That's procedural. That could then start the process through the New York court state system, which could take over a year. Now, you said, as you pointed out in the intro, his supporters have been kind of throwing around the Supreme Court should get involved, the Supreme Court this. But you have to go through, when you're challenging a criminal conviction, the state court system first. Then he would turn to try to get the Supreme Court to take the case by raising constitutional issues. As for the appeal itself that he'll try to file, the lawyers throughout the trial, I think, were laying the groundwork for possible issues from start to finish. I mean, starting with the venue in heavily Democratic New York, the indictment, the charges themselves, a pretty novel legal theory, bringing in federal election law to a state case. He's going to talk about the evidence that was allowed or not allowed. He could talk about the jury instructions and certain components of that, even attacking the impartiality of the judge himself. But that is a very tough road to hoe. He's got to show this is clear, reversible error. That is very difficult to do on any kind of appeal. And so, I mean, that's why people say, Bob, if you're ever in trouble, spend your money on a good trial lawyer, because once you get into the appeals process, the odds are not good, and not good for Donald Trump here.
Bob, the political impact here, obviously, we're in the early stages, but we know that Laura Trump, who's chair of the RNC, said on another network this morning they had raised $70 million in 48 hours. Is this only helpful?
It's helpful in terms of raising money, but for former President Trump, there is still a logistical nightmare on the horizon. When I spoke to his lawyer, Todd Blanche, he didn't rule out the possibility that Trump could be in jail during the Republican National Convention. When sentencing happens on July 11th, there's an expectation he could be put on probation. But this was a tense trial. I was there for 7 weeks. When you sat inside that court, at times the judge cleared the courtroom because he was so frustrated with the defense and one of the witnesses that was being called. Trump violated the gag order multiple times. So Republicans, the top Republicans in this country, are privately telling me they're not ruling out the possibility that Trump could be in prison when he accepts the nomination. And there's a real concern that some traditional Republicans, suburban Republicans, might look at someone being called a convicted felon and say, I really can't go there, even as it motivates so many of Trump's core supporters.
But, Jan, I mean, from all the research we've done, it seems like legal experts do not believe that there will be jail time.
Not in this kind of case. Not in this kind of case.
Is that just a political talking point?
His age. I mean, I think it would be pretty shocking to most people who follow the New York court system that he would get jail time for this.
And that's not just because of Secret Service detail,
or
who he is.
If he's treated like other defendants facing this similar charge. Again, also because of his age, he would be a first-time offender, and the charge itself is somewhat unusual, bringing in that federal election law. So typically in these kind of cases, you would have other charges, fraud charges, that could then carry jail time. So that makes this case different as well. It's just this one issue.
But he does now have a criminal record. And there are 3 other criminal cases. Just to remind people, in the federal level, the special counsel has the 2, one related to national security and mishandling classified information, the other trying to change the outcome of the 2020 election, and then there's the Georgia case as well. When will the Supreme Court make a decision on whether Mr. Trump will face charges and trial ultimately for these federal cases?
Well, of course, Trump has said he's absolutely immune from prosecution. He lost that argument in every court that is first considered. I think he's going to lose that in the Supreme Court, that he's absolutely immune. But this court does seem to think, like on the civil side, there may be some immunity. And so they're working on that decision now. We expect it by the end of June. They have agreed to expedite this case. This case, if it were on the normal course of business, would come sometime in the fall or winter. So Jack Smith, the special counsel, asked for a decision sometime this term. He is going to get that. The question now is whether or not he will then have time, if this case has to go back to the lower court and kind of figure out what immunity Trump does have, whether he will have time to have a trial before November. But I think this verdict does lessen the pressure on the Supreme Court and on Jack Smith to get that conviction. There is a conviction now already, and it's not going to be overturned by November.
Interesting point. Bob, quickly, our polling also shows 85% of Republicans feel loyalty to Trump is either very or somewhat important. How's that impacting the campaign?
People close to former President Trump tell me that he is watching very closely who's on television defending him, who's going out there and really speaking out and saying Trump did not deserve to be found guilty, who is going to rally to his side at a crisis moment. Inside the Trump campaign, this is seen a lot like the Access Hollywood moment in October 2016, which was involved in a sense with why this trial unfolded. And they're saying, if you're not out for Trump right now, good luck trying to get a spot in this administration should he win.
Great analysis and insight from both of you. Thank you. And Jan, you got a busy June ahead of you. We'll see more of you, I'm sure. And we turn now to former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara, who endorsed Alvin Bragg, the District Attorney of Manhattan, in his election. He also used to work with and actually hired Trump's attorney in the case, Todd Blanche. Good morning to you, Preet.
Good morning. Just one quick correction. I didn't hire Todd Blanche, but I did promote him twice. And I consider both Alvin Bragg and Todd Blanche to be friends of mine.
And He was Mr. Trump's attorney in this trial. So what does having this criminal record now do for Donald Trump with these other 3 criminal cases?
Oh, well, so that's an interesting question. There's a lot of speculation about whether or not this criminal conviction will result in a incarcerative period for Donald Trump. That's up in the air. There are arguments in favor, there are arguments against. But whatever happens, the fact of this criminal conviction will be on his record if it remains at such time as the future criminal trials take place. And if he gets a conviction on the federal counts in the future, the fact of this conviction here, if it's still on the books, would result in a potential higher prison sentence in those future cases. So it does have a consequence because he will now, unlike a week ago, have a criminal record, and criminal records are taken into account in meting out punishment.
Important point. You said you had promoted the president's attorney when you used to work together. Would you promote him based on his performance in court defending Mr. Trump?
It's a very easy thing that I do and other people do on the panel and criticize people's performances. Sometimes it's the case that someone could do a better job at trial. Trials are difficult and there's a lot of scrutiny here. But sometimes the facts in the law are what the facts in the law are. And sometimes terrific defense lawyers who perform very, very well lose. And sometimes not good defense lawyers win because the government hasn't proven its case. So I'm not going to take pot shots at Todd. I think he could have been stronger in some of the cross-examinations. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, sentencing is July 4th, July 11th, 4 days before the convention, as we mentioned. What grounds for appeal do you think Mr. Trump has here?
So I think they'll make a number of points. Donald Trump is not one to leave anything on the cutting room floor. I think some of his arguments are non-frivolous. I agree with what Jan said, that in the ordinary course, it's very, very difficult to get a criminal conviction overturned, but it happens. It's happened to me. It's happened to any good prosecutor's office that brings aggressive cases. Nobody has a 100% record on appeal. That said, it's a very low percentage. I think a number of things, including that the fact that the judge didn't change the venue, the fact that the judge didn't recuse himself. I don't think those are strong, but I think those will be made. The fact that Stormy Daniels testified a bit broadly about some of the scurrilous details of their sexual encounter, they will argue were prejudicial and should not have been allowed to come in, although they opened the door to that, arguably. And then there's this sort of technical business that I'm sure causes lay people's eyes to glaze over, and that is the degree to which the second crime, the thing that made and transformed the misdemeanor into a felony, the basis of that did not have to be decided unanimously by the jury. So the further crime, the felony, was appropriate based on the jury's decision if there was the falsification of the business documents was done to further or to conceal or to commit some other crime, namely an election crime in New York, and that could have been done 3 different ways. The jury instructions, and they don't have to be unanimous on those 3 different ways, and that's probably an issue for appeal.
Let me zero in on that because that has been something that Mr. Trump and his allies have talked about. In terms of this case, this was about trying to manipulate an election and fraud related to that. His allies say this was just, it was a paperwork thing. Somebody mislabeled this as a legal expense. How would you tell a layperson to understand this?
Yeah, look, the underlying misdemeanor, and that's why it's a misdemeanor, is falsifying business records. But the reason it becomes a felony, not the most serious felony on the books in New York, but a felony, and any felony is serious, is if that crime, that misdemeanor crime, was done to conceal or commit some other crime, and that other crime that the prosecutors alleged and got the convictions on was promoting someone's election by unlawful means, either done by the falsification of other documents or committing some other tax crime, or a further election fraud crime. And so the prosecution, I think, did it as well as anybody could do for lay people, because the jury obviously was a series of lay people, that this was a serious thing that undermined and interfered with the election in 2016. And that's serious and not to be taken lightly.
So, we're seeing some rhetoric from Republican lawmakers, including Senator Marco Rubio, who said Mr. Trump was held hostage, the victim of a sham political show trial like the ones the communists used in Cuba and the Soviet Union, railing against the ruling class. In terms of our judicial system in this country, how should someone understand a characterization like that?
Well, I think, it's silly. It's completely silly. The trial and all aspects of the trial were done openly and in public. The jury selection process, someone needs to be reminded, was participated in by the Trump legal team as well. They had all the peremptory challenges that they're accorded by law. The judge, although there's some accusations made about his impartiality or lack thereof, his rulings are there to see, as other people have pointed out. He ruled in favor of the Trump team sometimes. He ruled against the Trump team sometimes. He was pretty fair and even-handed. A jury of 12 people who were selected and approved by both sides brought in the verdict. So right. I don't know what is sham about it. The rules of evidence were followed and complied with, so I don't really know what's happening here, other than pure partisan politics.
Well, yesterday, President Biden was spending time with his son, Hunter. And tomorrow, in another unusual situation our country is in, the Biden Justice Department will begin a trial in Delaware against the president's son, where Hunter faces 3 felony gun possession charges, maximum 25 years prison. How much hot water is he in here?
He's in substantial hot water because he's been charged federally, just like Donald Trump is in a lot of hot water being charged in a state court. But I think an important thing to consider here, by the way, in the wake of your question about the accusations of this vast conspiracy by both state prosecutors and the federal Justice Department that is acting in a witch hunt fashion and a partisan fashion to bring down the Republican Party. Here you have the son of the sitting president of the United States of America going to trial at the hands of his own Justice Department. In a million years, can anyone listening to this broadcast understand and expect that if Donald Trump was elected again and a Biden holdover U.S. attorney were to indict Donald Trump Jr., that Donald Trump wouldn't do something about it in the way that Joe Biden has stayed out of it? I don't think so. So that's an important thing to remember. And also the other thing that's happening this week is a continuation of the trial against Democratic senior and important Senator Bob Menendez by the same Justice Department that these politicians are accusing of being partisan.
Okay. Preet Bharara, thank you for your insight and analysis. We're going to have to leave it there, and Face the Nation will be back in a minute. We turn now to North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. Based on our CBS News reporting, he is under serious consideration by the former president to become his running mate in this campaign. Good morning to you, Governor.
Good morning, Margaret. Good to be with you.
It's good to have you back on Face the Nation. You just heard our polling there. 57% of Americans think the jury reached the right verdict. 56% think Trump got a fair trial. A majority of Americans are unconvinced by this claim that it's all a sham. Why do you think it is?
Well, I think part of it, of course, polling is a point in time, and I had a chance to briefly look at some of your poll numbers this morning, and I also saw in there that almost 2/3 of the respondents said they weren't paying close attention. And I understand that they're not paying close attention to the trial because most Americans out there, they've got working Americans don't have time to watch, TV all day, read every report because they're facing all the things, putting food on the table, gas in the car, all the challenges that they're facing. And I think that as this moment in time passes, when we have the election coming this fall, people are going to make a decision about are they better off today than they were 4 years ago? And this is an unusual thing that this is not. President Trump's not a candidate that's unknown or never run before. They had an opportunity to live their life under 4 years of him, and they had a chance to, prosper, and they had a chance to understand what the world was like, no wars. And now that it's a very different situation. So I think, well, it's interesting and it's captivating right now to a lot of people. The election is not going to turn on this trial.
The U.S. isn't involved in a war right now either. But
we're involved in 2 proxy wars.
We were then as well. But on your point, Donald Trump spends a lot of time talking about these trials. It's not just journalists, and it's historic, but he talks quite a lot about it. And in fact, he held an extensive news conference Friday with a litany of grievances against the judge, who will still have to decide on his sentencing. Personal judgment-wise, do you think that was a smart thing to do?
Well, I have a lot of empathy for what he must feel like, and because as a business person, I spent 30 years in tech, but a lot of that was in software that dealt with business processes. I mean, I've never seen anything like this where you can, magically take a transaction that gets spread out over 11 paychecks, 12 vouchers, 11 invoices, and suddenly each of those around one decision, they magically become, instead of misdemeanors, they become a felony. And if there are
because of the election fraud, as you just heard.
Well, but I don't know that anybody in America, if we're asking about the voter, I don't know anybody in America can explain how a business transaction filing errors from 7 years ago become federal election law when federal election law is not a state. This is brought in a county court. Federal election is federal. And I don't know, the alchemy of transforming these misdemeanors, which had a 2-year statute of limitations. So I'm saying from a business perspective, CEOs around America, if you've had hundreds of millions of business filings in America in the last 7 years, why aren't our courts clogged with other CEOs that were dragged in front of the court?
If they were running for president and changing those business records to obscure donations to their own campaign, you know what I'm saying. This isn't just filing error.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but most Americans cannot explain it. Many of the legal experts, of the legal experts that stood on the curb outside the courthouse for 6 weeks can't explain it. So Americans are going to come back to the issues that affect them because this trial outcome doesn't affect them. Their inflation affects them.
It does. And I want to talk about some of those issues more in depth with you in a few minutes. We just put up a graph to show you our polling. It's 2/3 of those polled said they are watching closely. But in terms of like the bookkeeping argument, this was about a criminal conspiracy to influence an election and creating paperwork to cover it up. If the quibble is about paperwork violations, the President of the United States, his son, says under the influence of drugs, he committed a paperwork error. That's now going to federal court because of what he did in purchasing that gun. That was a paperwork violation. Are you also offended by that? Is that also a miscarriage of justice?
Well, I think what's sad for America is the whole weaponization of the system, and what we're going to see more of this. I mean, earlier in my life,
you think it's weaponized against Hunter Biden?
I think that is weaponized against President Trump. But if you're going to talk about equivalency in the courts, then we know that media companies have acknowledged that they worked in conjunction with the federal government to suppress information about Hunter Biden's laptop during an election year.
That is not true whatsoever when it comes to this journalist or the journalists involved with this program.
Well, then why were his stories about it taken down off of media companies? Why was it being suppressed during that election? Why talk about the Steele dossier? I mean, we could go back. There is all kinds of things going on in our country related to election integrity. And I think whether you're an independent, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, we should all care about election integrity. And if we want to have equivalency, then to make sure that we have a level playing field.
We have to finish this conversation on the other side of this commercial break. So let me do that, and we'll finish it. So stay with me, Governor. And stay with us. 1 second. Tune in on our streaming political show on CBS News 24/7 tomorrow. We'll have a lot more from our poll on Trump's guilty verdict. America Decides airs weekdays at 5 p.m. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We want to continue our conversation now with North Dakota Republican Governor Doug Burgum. Governor, North Dakota has tremendous energy resources, and you reportedly are helping the Trump campaign craft energy policy. That's accurate?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I'm just saying that I'm volunteering to support President Trump during this campaign because as an energy-rich state full of natural resources, and I've had the honor of being a governor under President Trump and also under President Biden, and I see the difference between the two administrations, and I've got a front row seat in understanding that the Biden energy policies are, hard on the American consumers. They're empowering adversaries overseas, and they're really tough on our allies.
There is more oil being produced in this country now than any country ever. 13 million barrels per day last year.
Yeah, and North Dakota's down and Iran is up under these policies. And the policies are built around the idea that somehow if you shut down the U.S. energy industry, that's going to be good for the environment. But when we stop production here, because it may be higher than it has been before by a little bit, but it should be much higher because we should be displacing energy coming from Venezuela,
well, let me ask you about that.
Coming from Russia. The people that are funding the wars that we're fighting are doing that on their oil sales.
Let me ask you that. According to the Washington Post in their reporting, Donald Trump met with oil executives and said if they raise $1 billion to return him to the White House, he'll reduce regulation if elected, start auctioning off leases for drilling in the...
I was at that meeting. That did not happen. That is not what happened at that meeting, and that's been reported over and over and over again.
Did he ask for $1 billion in donations?
He didn't ask for $1 billion in donations, and there was no quid pro quo. I mean, think what he did last time for the energy. This guy cut regulation for everybody, whether they donated to him or not. He helped get gas prices down for all Americans, Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, whether they donated to him or not.
Well,
drives me crazy.
The economy was also shut down.
People went on hearsay that weren't at the meeting on
too.
Hearsay report it like it's a fact when it's not a fact.
Well, I'm asking you to make sure. The Washington Post also reported that Trump suggested to those oil executives he would ease scrutiny of industry mergers and acquisitions if he wins. Do you think that the industry needs to consolidate and big oil needs to get bigger?
I think that the free enterprise needs to operate in ways that are efficiently to be able to compete on a global level. And what's going on in the industry.
So he would do that.
I'm not saying he would do that, but I tell you what Joe Biden's administration is doing right now. Two companies want to merge, and then they come in, and then they confiscate all the executives' phone numbers ahead of time, make accusations about collusions. This has never happened to another industry.
So what was promised in that meeting, since you said you were there?
He didn't make promises. He listened. He went around the room for 2 hours asking each of the people to tell me, what are your challenges? What are you facing? What are the things? He was there learning the whole night about the challenges that we're facing.
So is he targeting the industry to finance his re-election bid?
I think anybody he'll be meeting with people in Silicon Valley. He's meeting people across every industry. He's not targeting anybody. He's doing what candidates do, which is you go and listen to an industry, and this industry in particular, which is the fundamental to the entire economy. It's not just one industry. It feeds the inflation, which is affecting every American, to say, what can we do to produce cleaner energy more efficiently? President Trump talks all the time about getting oil prices down. Yeah. Oil executives are not thrilled when he says, I'm going to get oil prices down. You know, they make more money when oil prices are up.
Okay, so climate and environmental policy are important to young voters in particular. Are you at all concerned that you will alienate them by aligning so closely with the energy industry?
Well, I'm not concerned about it at all, because I know in North Dakota we are producing energy cleaner, safer, and smarter than any place else in the world here in the United States.
So you do want to keep some of the environmental restrictions then?
The environmental restrictions are hurting this country. They're not helping it. If innovation, if people think that you're going to solve the environmental issues with regulations, the way we solve that is with innovation. And the way we solve it with innovation is we innovate to have zero carbon liquid fuels or low carbon liquid fuels. The Biden administration is on Team China. They want to have every car be an EV, and then we got to get China controls 85% of the rare earth minerals.
Tariff them. Would talk to you for an hour about rare earth minerals, sir. We'll have to have you come back another time to talk about that global competition. But we're going to have to leave it there and turn to one of the crises right now out of the Middle East with the Israel-Hamas conflict. Joining us is Scott Anderson. He is the director of the UN's refugee efforts in Gaza. UNRWA is the largest relief agency for Palestinian refugees, and he joins us right now from Amman, Jordan. Scott, I know you were in the U.S. Army. You served 2 tours in Afghanistan. From what you've seen in Gaza, how does it compare? I'm sorry, I cannot hear Scott right now.
Sorry.
There you go.
I was going to say Gaza is much worse, Margaret, than Afghanistan was. I mean, everywhere you go, the scale of destruction just really defies description. You know, it looks like something out of a kind of post-apocalyptic movie. Most places you're looking at 90 to 100% destruction, with the infrastructure suffering much worse. So I never saw anything quite like that in Afghanistan that we're seeing now in Gaza.
The USAID chief, Samantha Power, said conditions are worse now in Gaza than ever before. She said that was due to the Israeli military operations and closed crossings. What exactly is the humanitarian situation right now?
So what you have is 2.2 million people that have all been displaced at least once. Most have been displaced multiple times. In Rafah, ahead of the operation, we had over 1 million people again displaced to Khan Yunis, to Deir al-Bella. And what they're lacking is really just the basic necessities that we all kind of expect. They need food, they need access to water, they need access to showers, access to toilets, access to medical care. And unfortunately, because of a variety of factors, we're unable to import everything that's needed and to make sure that everybody has the basic necessities that they need to get through every day.
19 different aid organizations released a letter this week saying Palestinians are surviving on less than 3% of their daily water needs. Hepatitis is spreading. Medical evacuations have been halted. Virtually every hospital has been issued evacuation orders. The Pentagon said it has suspended airdrops of food because of the Israeli military action. And as we know, the pier is not really operating. Who exactly is impeding the delivery?
I mean, I think it's a variety of things, not just one person that you can point to. All of the bulk of our aid comes in through Kerem Shalom. It all comes through Egypt, starts at Port Said, goes through the Sinai to Al Arish, and eventually makes its way to Kerem Shalom, where it's brought in then by us to the Palestinian side and then onward for the last mile distribution within Gaza. There's a lot of steps that have to go perfectly right for all that to work. And unfortunately, not everything has gone right. For a time, Egypt was not sending trucks where we had 80,000 metric tons of aid in country we couldn't access. And we've been perpetually playing catch up on the aid situation since October. Not everybody has a tent that needs one, so you have people sleeping outside still as we're 8 months after the start of the conflict. And you highlighted correctly our number one concern at this point, which is access to clean drinking water. You know, without that, in addition to hepatitis, you have things like cholera and other diseases that can become very prevalent. We could see an outbreak happen very soon. And it's something that concerns us. And additionally, it's getting hot. You know, it's summer. It's essentially you're in a desert. And if people don't have access to clean drinking water, that's a problem for dehydration as well as for disease.
I know you are with the UN, so you can't talk about politics and policy, but President Biden did make this address Friday talking about a proposal for a ceasefire and hostage deal. He said it would come with 600 aid trucks per day to enter Gaza with supplies, with shelter and the like. Who's going to be doing all of that distribution?
I mean, it'd be the entire international humanitarian community because of the scale. I mean, currently UNRWA feeds a little over half the population. We're feeding about 1.3 or 1.4 million people every day. But it would be us along with the rest of the UN and all our partners. And I would say we very much welcome a ceasefire. It's time for the hostages to go home to their families. Time for more aid to start coming in. And then hopefully we can start rebuilding Gaza.
Scott Anderson, thank you for telling us what you are seeing and experiencing on the ground. We'll be right back. We're joined now by the former commander of U.S. forces in the Middle East, retired General Frank McKenzie. His new book, The Melting Point, is available this Tuesday. Good to see you, sir.
Good to be here, Margaret.
So on Friday, President Biden said that Hamas is no longer capable of carrying out another October 7th. When you were last with us in February, you said Israel's success has been very limited. Do you think they can declare success now?
I think they're a lot closer than they were a few months ago. I still think Hamas political and military leadership exists largely whole. A lot of their combat formations have been destroyed, but I think Hamas has been significantly attrited.
You also have raised a few times in the past few months concerns about America's continued presence in the Middle East, which you say is crucial here. Right now, we are seeing so many different flashpoints. One of them in the Red Sea, where our CBS's David Martin reported the U.S. used a 5,000-pound bunker buster bomb in Yemen just this past week. The Houthis are attacking shipping. We have concerns about the troop safety in Syria and in Iraq. Does it need to continue?
Well, I think we remain the critical nation in the Middle East. I think everybody looks to us to be the honest broker. If we take the situation with the Houthis as simply one example, I would argue that we've been too passive. We've allowed the Houthis really to dominate global maritime communications by closing down effectively the Suez Canal. And that is something that's not only bad for the United States, but for many other nations around the world. It has nothing to do, actually, with Israel or the conflict in Gaza. Rather, it's a larger principle for the United States. But we've essentially been catching and not pitching in this conflict, despite deploying multi-billion-dollar warships into the Red Sea. The sign that we're dropping larger bombs may be a good thing, but we need to go after the source of the attacks. And the source of the attacks is Houthi leadership and command and control facilities in Yemen. And I would argue that the threat of escalation is very small if we conduct these attacks.
When you say we, you think the Biden administration?
I think the United States and our allies.
You largely try to avoid politics and directly addressing the presidents you served under in the book that you wrote here. But you have had such a key role in some of these very significant national security decisions, killing the ISIS commander Baghdadi, taking Qasem Soleimani off the battlefield, executing the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And you spread around some blame to past U.S. presidents. But you do point to the Doha Agreement, the withdrawal negotiated by the Trump administration, as one of the worst negotiating mistakes ever made by the U.S.
I think it was, and also by the way we implemented the agreement. Had we actually stuck to the strict terms of the agreement, we might have been able to make something of it. But in fact, we treated the Doha Agreement as a schedule for us to depart Afghanistan. And that policy objective remained across two presidents, President Trump and President Biden, when in fact there were procedures in the Doha Agreement, if we had respected them, that would require the Taliban to do certain things in return. We did not require that. And effectively, I would argue that the Doha Agreement was the operational mechanism that killed Afghanistan, that destroyed the government of Afghanistan, because they saw we were eager to leave regardless of cost. And that was a very important and deflating thing, I think, for the government of Afghanistan.
But as you point out, that was across two presidents.
Absolutely.
Biden and Trump.
Margaret, I would argue that President Trump and President Biden were as unlike as any two presidents in our history, but they both shared a policy objective of leaving Afghanistan, regardless really of consequences.
You drafted resignation letters a few times, but the only time you actually came close was after that withdrawal from Afghanistan and a drone strike, August 29th, that was intended to kill ISIS but killed civilians. If you had such strong objections, why was that the moment where you almost resigned and not others?
So I feel it's very important that generals don't resign over policy differences. That's not good for the Republic. It's not the way that our military system should work. And historically, it's not the way it has worked. Back through the Korean War, back through the Second World War, many generals, many senior generals disagreed with presidential decisions, but they did not resign. So I did not feel it was appropriate to resign. In my particular case, if there had been discussions of charging my subordinates, then I felt it was necessary for me to actually accept part of that blame. Now, we did not do that.
Right. You stayed on. You, in the book, talk quite a lot about conversations you had around how to implement the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the planning for it, particularly with the Trump administration. At one point, you say the chief of staff to President Trump, Mark Meadows, advised not to present certain options out of concern he'd choose them, like going to zero in Afghanistan. You wrote Trump made the decision to kill Qasem Soleimani, but his national security advisors were telling him there won't be any consequences for it, which is not what U.S. intelligence said, and that is not what U.S. CENTCOM thought. Why is it important for the public to know that the people around the commander-in-chief were either not sharing full picture with him or changing what he was allowed to see?
Well, every president, whether either the last two, have advisors that give him all kinds of different opinions. The military input that comes in is one part of that, and that was and I was relentlessly focused on that. Every president also has to make political calculations, not just these two presidents, but presidents as far back as President Roosevelt in the Second World War had to balance internal U.S. political objectives with what was going on around the world. So that's not new or unusual in these times. I think in the case of Qasem Soleimani, I think President Trump made the right decision. I do not believe ultimately we made the right decision in Afghanistan, and I've been pretty clear about that in open testimony, and that goes across two presidents.
But it is cherry picking, right, information to present to the commander-in-chief when he has to make a call. And you write about the internecine bickering, you say, and finger-pointing that followed Trump political appointees at the Pentagon. You wrote about the choice of drawing down to 2,500 troops. You said you don't even know where that number came from. It was kind of arbitrary. And there was an incident in which a mysterious signed letter appeared saying withdraw from Afghanistan. And you hunted that down, and it was ultimately discarded. How does something like that happen with such high consequence? And do you fear that it could happen again if there is a second Trump administration?
Well, Margaret, I think the period of time from the presidential election of 2020 2021 until the inauguration of 2022 was a particularly dangerous time inside the Pentagon. And I believe that's where the U.S. military has a role to play. It's a non-political role. It's a role where we answer the orders that we're given. And at the same time, you have political appointees inside the Pentagon that are appointed by the president, members of his party, and they have their own objectives there. And we respond to orders from the chain of command. It's very important to know who can actually give orders and who can't give orders. A lot of people that walk around the Pentagon are not in a position to give orders. The orders flow from the president to the secretary to the combatant commanders. Everyone else has an opinion, and those opinions may actually impact the decisions that are made, but they're not in the chain of command.
General, it is a fascinating read. Thank you for coming on to talk about the book.
Thanks, Margaret.
We'll be back. And we're joined now by Matt Pottinger, who served as Deputy National Security Advisor in the Trump administration. He is the author of the new book, The Boiling Moat: Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan, available in July. Matt, you say the clock's ticking. Beijing has been engaged in the most comprehensive peacetime military buildup of any nation since World War II. Are you predicting that conflict will happen either on President Biden or President Trump, if he's reelected, on their watch?
Well, what is clear is that the dictator in Beijing, Xi Jinping, intends to try to take Taiwan, to annex it by force if necessary. We also know that this would be catastrophic for American prosperity and security. But my co-authors and I are actually quite optimistic that this is a war that can be deterred, but it means that we've got to take some steps urgently. These are workable steps. It doesn't require massive new investment. We've got the technologies we need, but Taiwan, Japan, and the United States in particular need to take the steps that we think we've laid out in the book.
This week, the defense secretary is in Asia, and he actually met with his Chinese defense minister counterpart. You can see it there. This is like the first meeting since 2022. Last guy disappeared.
Yeah.
But Austin said a fight with China is neither imminent or unavoidable. When we hear the kind of rhetoric out of Washington right now, it sounds like we are headed towards conflict. What are the things you're saying need to be done to avoid it?
Yeah, well, for starters, we need to invest more in munitions making. Okay, so one of the things that the Chinese government is looking at is, would we be able to stay in a fight more than just the first, the initial battle that would be involved in taking Taiwan? If they don't think we have the industrial base, and right now we haven't optimized our industrial base to do that.
Even with the national security supplemental investment.
Absolutely. Look, we amazingly, I don't think many Americans realize our defense spending right now is less than half of what it was in the 1980s during the Cold War. And that was during the Reagan administration. We didn't have to go to war, partly because we put the money into that. Our military, in terms of manpower, is smaller today than it was on the eve of World War II. So we have to put more money into it. But we also have to do things to optimize our defense spending so that it's not guaranteed profits, no matter how inefficient the manufacturers are. There are things that we can do to supercharge our military manufacturing, to take advantage of our innovative base.
It's interesting to hear you, and before you, the general, talk about the scale of the problem set facing the president of the United States and the next commander-in-chief. So that's why I think it's important to have this conversation this week. You did resign from the Trump administration after the violent attack on the Capitol on January the 6th. You then testified to Congress that you feared America's national security was in harm that day, that it gave ammunition to feed a narrative that our system of government doesn't work, the U.S. is in decline. If you continue to contest an election, you're not just contesting an election, you're actually challenging the Constitution itself. Do you fear that erosion is taking place right now with what we are hearing on the campaign trail? Well,
look, I think the perception of erosion is. I actually think the United States is incredibly strong. We have all of these advantages. This century can be ours if we don't lose our nerve. I think that look, Election Day will be a referendum. It's the best kind of referendum. It's where the American people get to decide who the next president's going to be. I hope that the outcome is decisive so that we don't end up with either side challenging the results. But if they do, just like with the last election, the courts will determine it. We have a system in place that allows us to adjudicate the outcomes of our elections.
But now you even have like the ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee coming out and repeating things that undercut our judicial system. Comparing the United States to the Soviet Union?
Yeah. Well, look, there's no way.
What does Beijing think of that?
Yeah. Look. Well, Beijing is kind of an interesting moment because Beijing really relishes propaganda that is designed to discredit the United States or to cause us to doubt our system of government. But at the same time, you have a jury that is just convicted president of the United States. You've also got the son of a sitting president who's now under indictment, just like you heard from Preet Bharara earlier. Beijing's propaganda can only go so far. At the end of the day, Americans, thank God, we live in a system where the American people are going to decide who their president is. They have all the information available to them.
And we will try to bring it to them here. Thank you very much, Matt. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. I'm Margaret Brennan.